I want to consider now in further detail what exactly the relationship between the soul and the body is, according to Aristotle. And we're going to do that by considering two examples that Aristotle gives. Because at a certain point, Aristotle says something like inquiring into whether or not the soul and the body are two different things is we've kind of solved that now with our example, and he doesn't really spell it out, but he says or implies that we've kind of solved that issue with the analysis that he gives. And the examples are supposed to do this. The way that some commentators on Aristotle have formulated Aristotle's account is to say the following. These commentators have said, according to Aristotle, the soul is a functional organization of the body. Aristotle never uses that exact phrase, but it gets at what exactly Aristotle is illustrating with these examples. These examples illustrate the way in which the soul is a functional organization of a body. And by understanding how the soul is a functional organization of a body, we should understand better what exactly the relationship between the body and the soul are. Okay, so what are the two examples? They are the example of an axe, and he says something like, imagine an axe were alive. And then he goes on and says some things. And there's an example of an eyeball. The eyeball example is clarifying. It's very helpful. We're going to look at it in just a second. The axe example, not so much. It doesn't make it makes sense, but it's not exactly clarifying. And so we're going to look at a different example. I'm going to give you my own example just very briefly. Instead of talking about an axe, I'm going to talk about a car. I think you can, obviously Aristotle didn't have cars, but the point can be made, I think, a little bit more clearly by thinking about something like a car. So that's what we'll look at. But first, Aristotle's eyeball example. So he asks us to imagine that an eyeball were an organism in its own right. Now, it's not, according to Aristotle, right? An eyeball is merely a part of a larger organism. And eyeballs, when they're separated from their larger organism, are no longer really eyeballs, according to Aristotle, because they don't really perform their function. The function of an eyeball is to see. That's its work or activity or function, right? That's what eyeballs do. They see. And if you take an eyeball out of a human being, the eyeball can no longer see. It can no longer perform its function. It's an eyeball in name only, Aristotle wants to say. Okay. But what he asks us to do now is imagine, even though it's impossible, imagine that the eyeball were an independent organism. Imagine that whatever, it's gruesome, but imagine you took an eyeball out of a guy or whatever, and the eyeball itself was an independent animal, right? Organism. Aristotle says that its soul would be the power to see. Its soul would be the power to see. Now, he didn't know about all the parts of the eyeball like we do, right? So I'll label a few of them there. The lens, the iris, I don't know how to pronounce aqueous humor. I don't know what it is. I just looked this up online, right? And there are more parts besides those, right? But those are the three that we're going to work with. He didn't know about all those parts or whatever. Or didn't list them all at the very least, even if he didn't know about them. He said that the matter of an eyeball, the parts of an eyeball, the organs of an eyeball, if you will, the matter that makes up the eyeball, was simply eye jelly. That's what he calls it. And I guess there is some truth to that. That whole kind of reddish, pinkish, orangish part, I guess, just is jelly. I don't know. But in any event, so we're considering the eyeball as a kind of independent organism, which then would be composed of matter and form. And the matter of an eyeball, according to Aristotle, is simply the eye jelly. Knowing more about eyes, we'd say it's the iris and lens and aqueous humor and the retina and the optic nerve and all the other parts besides, right? Those are the parts. Those are the matter of an eyeball. Now, the form, according to Aristotle, is the power to see. Well, what exactly does that mean? What Aristotle would point out, and he's not as clear about this as he might be, but what he would point out is that when you take the matter of an eyeball, the parts of the eyeball, when you take eye jelly, or to put it in more contemporary terms, when you take an iris, a lens, a retina, an optic nerve, an aqueous humor, and so on, and all these other parts of the eye, and you arrange them in a highly specific and particular way, when you organize the matter of an eye, whether it's eye jelly or the iris, lens, and aqueous humor, in a highly specific and particular way, all of a sudden you get sight. That's what the power of sight is. It's simply the organization of those parts that gives rise to sight, to seeing, to that function. If you were to, right, and so what we have here in this diagram is a properly organized eye. An eyeball like that will see. If, however, you were to move the iris to the back of the eyeball and then the lens back behind the nerve and the aqueous humor you just kind of threw in the middle of all the eye jelly or whatever, right? If you messed up that organization of the eye, well, what you see before you right now, that thing can no longer see. That's Aristotle's point. Because you've rearranged all those parts, that thing can no longer see. And if this eyeball were a kind of independent organism, right, an animal in its own right, what you would have done by messing up the arrangement of those parts is kill it. You would have destroyed its soul. It would no longer be alive. Its soul is simply the organization of its parts, right there, that give rise to its characteristic activities, namely seeing. And it's this organization that you see before you now that does that, right? Whereas this one, nope. And so this, if the eyeball were an independent organism, this would be a dead eye because we messed up the organization that allowed it to perform its life functions, namely seeing. And so what Aristotle wants to say is that the power of sight simply is the soul of the eye, if the eye were an independent living organism. And what we have now seen is that the power of sight is simply a particular organization of particular parts of a particular kind of matter. Which particular organization? It's that organization which gives rise to a certain function, namely seeing. And so the soul is nothing other than an organization of parts which gives rise to a particular function. That's the sense in which the soul is a functional organization of the body. It's an organization of body parts that gives rise to certain life functions. And the eyeball example is supposed to illustrate this. We could run the same kind of idea with other examples. It's a highly particular organization of the small intestine and large intestine and stomach and esophagus and so on that gives rise to digestion. The nutritive soul is nothing other than a highly particular organization of those organs, of those body parts. The nutritive soul is the organization of the stomach and liver and the intestines and so on, the organization that gives rise to digestion. That's what the nutritive soul is. It's simply that organization. That's Aristotle's view, right? And so the soul is not some airy spiritual substance or something like that. It's simply the organization of these organs, of these body parts. It's this organization that gives rise to these life functions. Aristotle's other example that's supposed to illustrate this is an axe. We're not going to do that, and we're not going to even go into detail here on this second example. But consider, instead of an axe, consider a car. Imagine that a car were actually a living being. Well, then its soul would be the ability to drive, right? The soul of and why I think that? Well, like the soul of a plant is nourishing and growing. The soul of an animal is nourishing, growing, and perceiving. It's what those things do, right? Well, so then likewise, if you had a car, and we're imagining, even though it's not, we're imagining that it were alive, its soul would be what it does, which in this case would be driving. It'd be its characteristic functions. And so the soul of the car would be driving. Well, look, a car is more than the sum of its parts. Why? Because if you just had a pile of car parts sitting in your driveway, right, just in a pile, that thing can't drive. What needs to happen is those parts, those car parts, need to be arranged in a highly specific manner, in a very specific order, right? The drivetrain needs to be hooked up to the engine in this particular way, which needs to be hooked up to the radiator, which blah, 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 and that's all I know about cars. You need to arrange all those things in a highly specific way in order to give rise to the ability to drive. The soul of the car is nothing other than the highly specific arrangement of those parts that gives rise to the ability to drive. And this reveals why shape is not the perfect way, or can be a misleading way of thinking about it. Because the shape of a car, right? You can just arrange everything into the shape of a car. That thing that you shape into a car can't necessarily drive, though, right? There's more to being a car than simply having the shape of a car, right? Because if you just kind of construct the frame and the body of the car and then just willy-nilly throw all the other parts inside, well, that thing can't drive. All those other internal parts need to be arranged in a highly specific way, right? And so it's really more like arrangement, organization, or order. That's really what the form of a thing is, right? And so that's what this car example also reveals. It's very similar to the eyeball example. And in the same way, if you have a fully functioning car with the proper organization of its parts and so on, and then I go in with a sledgehammer or something and just start messing it all up, well, I'm disrupting that functional organization of those parts. And so, yeah, no surprise, that thing is no longer going to be able to drive. And if that thing were alive, even though it's not, we're imagining it as an organism, by messing up its parts, by messing up the organization of its parts, I should say, I'd effectively be murdering the car. I'd be killing the car. Yeah. It should be obvious, I think, but let's spell it out, how this applies to the human case. You just have we were talking about having a pile of car parts or whatever, right? That thing can't drive. Well, a pile of human parts, the human matter, that's not alive. That can't engage in the life activities, right? A pile of human parts can't see or taste or reproduce or whatever it might be. It needs its proper organization. It's the organization of those parts that would give rise to those various activities. That is the form of human being. That is what the human soul is. It's the organization of those body parts that would give rise to the various life activities that we talked about in a previous video, right? It's the organization of the stomach and intestines and esophagus and so on that gives rise to digestion. That's in part what the human soul is. It's that organization of parts. It's the organization of the veins and arteries and heart and so on that gives rise to those particular life functions, right? The pumping of the blood, and then the blood goes and nourishes your cells and so on. It's the organization of whatever, taste buds, and so I don't know how it works exactly. Taste buds and nerves and so on that gives rise to taste. The organization of the iris, lens, and retina and everything else that gives rise to sight. Yeah. All those things together are part of the human soul. And so the human soul is the organization of all the particular parts of human beings that gives rise to all those various life activities, right? And so now when we combine that organization, when we take those parts and organize them in the way specified by the form of human being, when we impart the form of human being into those parts, that is to say, when we impart a soul into human matter, well, now you get this hylomorphic compound, which can engage in all those life activities, that can see, that can taste, that can reproduce, and so on, right? That's Aristotle's view of the soul. And so one of the main implications of this view is that the nutritive soul and the perceptive soul are inseparable from the body. Think of it like this. If you have a car that's in fully, that works, it's in good working order, and I go and take my sledgehammer to it and mess up that organization and order that gives rise to the ability to drive, it's not as though that organization just floats away from the car and continues to exist. That organization is simply an organization of those parts. And when I mess up that organization and so make it so your car will no longer drive, I have destroyed that organization. It's no longer there. It doesn't just float off and go somewhere else. I destroyed it. It's gone. The organization is gone. Well, in the same way, if I were to, again, not to be too gruesome about it, but if I were to mess up the organization of your eyeball, that part of the perceptive soul is just gone, right? If I were to mess up all your sense organs, right? Rearrange all your nerves so you couldn't really touch, right? Cut all the, whatever, the connection. I don't know what it's called. Synapse. I don't know what it's called. But, rearrange all those parts. It's not as though your soul would just float off and go somewhere else, your perceptive soul at least. No, I just destroyed the organization. The perceptive soul, the nutritive soul, those are nothing other than the particular organization of those body parts. And as such, they are inseparable from those body parts. When you rearrange those body parts and thus destroy the organization is simply gone. Right? That's Aristotle's idea. Now, one thing you'll notice is that all I've talked about is the nutritive soul and the perceptive soul. What about the rational soul? We're going to talk about that next. It's a different story with the rational soul. This does not apply to the rational soul. What Aristotle is going to argue is that the rational soul is separable from the body. But one last implication. And so the story is different with human beings. So separable. What's the upshot here? This is really what we're talking about when we're asking the question whether or not the soul is separable from the body is whether or not we can exist after our bodily death. Will our soul continue to exist after our bodily death? What Aristotle has claimed to show so far, at least, is that our nutritive and perceptive soul, those parts of our soul at least, will not survive our bodily death. When our body dies, those parts go away too. What that means then is that when a plant dies, it's just dead. When you're, and so, when you're, not to rain on anybody's parade or be a downer or whatever, but when your dog dies, your dog is just dead. There is no doggy heaven. Dogs just die and they're dead, and that's it. Because all dogs have are a nutritive and perceptive soul. And those things simply are the organization of certain body parts. And so when the dog dies, that organization dies. The dog is just gone. Right? That's Aristotle. That's an implication of Aristotle's view. And it's that way for all animals. No mere animals, no non-rational animals survive their bodily death. Well, I've been carving out all these exceptions for human beings and for the rational soul. So what exactly does Aristotle think about all that? We'll turn to that next.